All right, thank you, everybody. Welcome to today's meeting of the Finance and Corporate Services Select Committee at the London Borough of Hillingdon. This meeting is being broadcast on the Council's YouTube channel, Hillingdon, London. The purpose of this committee is to monitor service areas within the Council that fall within its terms of reference, and we also undertake in-depth reviews and witness sessions on specific topics and submit our findings to the decision-making cabinet. My name is Councillor John Riley, and I'm chairman of this committee. Before we start, I have some important housekeeping for everyone present. Please ensure that mobile phones and any other devices are set on silent. We're not expecting a fire drill, so if the fire alarm does go off, please follow the officers out of the building. Please turn your microphone on when speaking and then turn it off when you're not speaking. As chairman, I will call on those to speak during the meeting. We can go on to the agenda, but it might be useful if we go around the table and just say who everybody is. We start with Councillor Mathers.
Councillor Stuart Mathers.
Councillor Narindagog.
Councillor Gasharan Mand.
David Mohammed, Head of Business Performance of the Council.
Kevin Westbrook, Interim Counter Fraud Manager.
Laura Piggott, Counter Fraud Manager.
I'm Mark O'Halloran, I'm also a Counter Fraud Manager.
And I'm Alex Brown, Head of Counter Fraud.
Councillor Shahriar Ahmed Walana.
Councillor Kishan Bhatt.
Councillor Kaushik Banerjee.
Everyone gets used to pressing the button, I didn't. All right, thank you. So we go to the agenda. Apologies for absence.
Yes, Chairman, apologies from Councillor Richard Lewis. Councillor Ahmed Walana is kindly substituting tonight.
And Councillor Ahmed Walana is very welcome. Nice to see you. Declarations of interest in matters coming before the meeting. Any go? No. Okay, thank you. So, minutes of the meeting of the 8th of February. Those who were here, fairly extensive minutes. Where we... Oh, Councillor Mays.
Don't mean to interrupt your flow, sorry, Chair. I just wanted to make a comment on the Cabinet Forward Plan where it was agreed that any comments would be submitted via email or before the meeting. I just wondered if we may want to review that decision when we get to the item later on, because I'm just wondering if that's in the spirit of transparency. Urgent ones, I absolutely agree with email. I was just thinking where they're a long way ahead, and Councillor Lewis made a good point about us looking quarterly at least ahead because of the time it takes to do these things, whether we should make at least some comment for the public and others as we go. But that's just maybe something to consider as we look at it later.
I think the actual method of raising them would still be a good idea in terms of email, but as you say, what we could do is to put it as an agenda item and go once we've got them and we know what they are, we could then comment on them as being items that kind of trumpets it for the future. I think that's probably the best way of doing it. All right, thank you. Any other comments about the minutes? Are they agreed? Thank you. Just to say that all items will be in public. There are no Part 2 items. All right, now for the excitement of the evening. And I really mean that, because I'm probably one of the few other people, other than the 4 or 5 of you, that actually find this, fraud and counter-fraud quite exciting, especially in the day job. And we have an extremely helpful and extensive report which has generated a great deal of discussion in terms of interest and questions. So I think probably the best thing to do is to let you talk us through it, and then we'll ask questions later on. Yes, good point. Well done. Okay. In terms of questions, obviously we can't ask questions and shouldn't ask questions about any existing and ongoing cases, and also any specific cases. The other thing also is that we shouldn't ask questions that cause the answer to reveal techniques and other types of ways of doing things, because we don't really want to let however many people are watching this or recording it know exactly how we managed to nab them. And that wouldn't be very wise. But anything else, I mean, I'm sure you'll tell us if you're not very happy with answering, but it's just a general warning to all my colleagues that wouldn't be such a good idea. All right? Okay.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to take the committee through the Council Fraud Overview Report, which starts on page 7 of your agenda packs. The report gives you a cradle-to-grave view of all things counter fraud, in particular our strategic and operational approach. You may also see that I brought a bit of an entourage with me this evening. This is the Counter Fraud Management team, and they'll be presenting to you in a short while around operational matters and outcomes in the final financial year to date. I'd like to start by taking you through the counter fraud strategy. The strategy was presented to the Corporate Management Team and Audit Committee in early 2022 and was later agreed by the Cabinet in 2022. The strategy has been set for the next 3 years, and it focuses around 4 main principles. The first is our partnership and engagement. So this is us communicating with service areas and stakeholders to understand the fraud risks that the Council faces. And it also creates a counter-fraud culture within the organisation through fraud awareness training, how to report, sort of what to look for. The next is prevent, detect, pursue and deter. And this is like the cornerstone of any sort of counter-fraud or enforcement strategy. But here at Hillingdon there is quite a focus on prevention. And that's the reason for that is obviously preventative measures are more cost-effective than cure. Next is innovation and modernisation. So there's to run an effective and efficient counter fraud service, we're trying to use great use of technology and also go paperless within our processes. And lastly is a risk-based approach. Now, the way we do this is, well, the reason we do this is so we deploy resources into the highest areas of fraud, and we do this in 2 ways. First of all, we have our fraud universe, which I'll come on to in a moment, and second of all is through our risk assessment process. So the risk assessment process is effectively how we triage our referrals and decide whether we should investigate matters further. And we do this by scoring the risk against the following. So we look at financial risk, reputational risk, operational risk and systemic risk. In terms of the fraud universe, it's also more commonly known as a fraud risk register. The universe comprises of a list of fraud risks by service area, which details the risk score, the mitigation that's in place, who the risk owners are, and the risk direction of travel. And then this is reviewed periodically by the management team with key stakeholders. This then actually informs our annual operational work plan, so which our current year's work plan is detailed in Appendix A. So the plan covers all sorts of proactive and reactive work streams within counter fraud. But there are a variety of activities we do undertake within that. So that's criminal investigations, civil investigations, disciplinary investigations where appropriate and instructed to by HR, proactive projects to target areas of risk, and something called verifications, which is quite unique to Hillingdon from my experience in terms of counter fraud. This is where we actually assess person's eligibility for certain schemes so that we're actually preventing fraud from entering the system in the first place. Also data matching, so we try and use data internally and externally to identify fraud, loss and error. And lastly, something that's been quite new to us over the last 12 months to support our colleagues in internal audit is consultancy work. So we will go into service areas and we will review processes to highlight recommendations to improve fraud controls. Looking at the team itself and the structure, so the team is actually either already fully qualified in counter fraud or they are currently studying. And the current structure is in Appendix B of this report. There are 4 sub-teams within counter fraud. First is the Housing Investigations Unit, which Laura is responsible for. This essentially looks at all forms of housing fraud, from right to buy fraud, homeless applications, and obviously tenancy fraud, including subletting, non-occupation and abandonment. Then we have the Special Investigations Unit, which is run by Kevin. This looks into internal matters, disciplinary cases. It also supports internal audit with the consultancy work that I've just mentioned. And the team also carries out all work relating to social care fraud, including Blue Badge. Then we have the Revenues Investigations Unit, which is managed by Mark. So the core function of the team is to inspect premises relating to council tax and business rates with a focus on maximising income for the council. Officers also investigate to do with council tax discounts, exemptions, the council tax reduction scheme and any sort of unlawful evasion. Next we have the Data Analytics Unit. This is also headed up by Mark, and this is actually the hub of the counter fraud team. So it works across all of the sub-teams. They risk assess all referrals, they gather intelligence, they provide an administrative function to proactive projects, and they also handle all the data matching within the service. So the next thing naturally to move on to is how we report and who we report to and how do we measure our success. Well, first of all, we measure our success in 3 different ways. The first of all, we have a set of KPIs which are centred around our operational activity, which are updated to the corporate management team and audit committee on a quarterly basis, and this is in Appendix C of the report. Second of all, each year we produce an annual report, and during that we actually start to benchmark against other London boroughs. This can be quite difficult because not every borough basically looks at their outcomes in a different way, and the methodology behind the financials behind it can vary from borough to borough. So this can be quite challenging. And lastly, we have a financial loss prevention target each year, which is set in collaboration with the Section 151 and the Cabinet Member of Finance. And this currently stands at £3.5 million for this year. So that's kind of like an overview of the structure of the team. So what does this all mean in terms of operationally and what we're delivering? Well, essentially, up to the end of Q3 of this year, we've actually achieved £10.7 million in loss prevention savings, and there's a full breakdown available for you in Appendix D. And at this time, I'd like to hand over to my managers to give you a little bit more detail on the operational side.
Good evening, Chair, members. As Alex has said, I'm responsible for managing the Revenues Investigation Unit and the Data Analysis Unit, which is quite a broad church on the whole. The Revenues Investigation Unit, without repeating ground, looks at income to the council largely through business rates and council tax. A lot of that is achieved through proactive work, so the inspectors are out a lot, going out and visiting premises, making sure all the records are up to date and the right billing is in place. It's called revenue maximisation on the team, which is looking to make sure that's the case. That's done with our own team. We also use external partners to add to that resource. And a year-to-date figure now is an additional £5.7 million of billing, which is coming in through business rates, through changes that have been identified. The Data Analysis Unit is really the core of the team, the front door, if you will. It's where all referrals come in and a lot of the data work is done. Looking forward to the next year is going to be quite an exciting time for that team. We're bringing forward a lot of new business streams and data matching work to make sure we're identifying as much as possible. I'm working with other London boroughs through the London Counter Fraud Hub, which I think is mentioned in the report, to improve the speed and quality of the data matching we're receiving, up to the almost real time in some cases, which is quite exciting, and it will help prevent those issues sort of festering. We'll get to them earlier and prevent losses going forwards.
Laura, do you want to?
Evening, Chair and members. I manage the Housing Investigations Unit within the Counter Fraud team. We're looking at anything housing-related matters that start from applications that are coming through. We sit with the data analytics team and do the verification work around that, and then we look into all other housing matters that include just sublets, non-occupations, abandonments. Part of that is we're looking at temporary accommodation and emergency accommodation with the bed and breakfast. So this year we've been doing some proactive work there, which has brought back in 23 emergency accommodation units closed and 10 temporary accommodation units closed. and then we carry on with our proactive work in other areas, which bring in our secure tenancies, which we've closed 68 of them. There'll be anything through from referrals, anonymous referrals. We do a lot of outreach into the residents through Twitter, social media, campaigns. We ran a key amnesty campaign last year that was, really highlighting that it's a criminal offence to be subletting your property. We do a lot of work within housing themselves. We look at areas which are high risk in sense of, for example, gas safety. We run a project on that. We'll look at something where we've got residents where their gas safeties are coming up to an end, and we need to just make sure we're getting into the properties, ensuring that they're safe, and ensuring that everybody is there with that. We look at right to buys. We cancel right to buy, 6 right to buys this year. We also look at the first time buyer grants. Although that grant has ceased, we do the post sale checks. That runs for 3 years. So we're looking at the first time buyer grants for that. And then we're working with the NFI Fraud Hub. The NFI Fraud Hub brings in ready data for us, so we can work reactively on that. So it's a busy unit, very busy. So Kevin?
Good evening, Chair and members. As Alex said, my name's Kevin Westbrook, and I'm responsible for the Special Investigations Unit. The unit predominantly look at all social care related matters, so investigations into fraud, loss and error across the social care service. Those investigations will look at Section 17 cases, direct payments, as well as Blue Badge, for example. Alex touched on it earlier as well. It's my team that carry out all the fraud consultancy reviews across the organisation, as well as any internal and disciplinary matters. The SIU are relatively unique with regards to those social care cases that we pick up. The cases are quite often lengthy and complex, and it will involve multi-departments getting together to look at the matter and address what needs to be addressed. This year, the team have achieved £210,000 worth of loss prevention savings within that department, or within that team, sorry. What we found with cases within social care is they're quite high monetary value, and that's why they're so complex as well, because of people's needs that we're investigating, and also obviously the different departments that are involved in those care needs. To give you an example, one case we had a look at this year, it was part of a financial assessment process where a family member decided to not disclose a property that should have been taken into consideration as part of the financial assessment process. This meant that the property was disregarded from that process, and we identified £106,000 worth of loss prevention savings for the organisation. So although they are time consuming, when we can evidence that fraud, loss or error has taken place, it's well worth us looking into those matters, and it does add value to the organisation. We spend a lot of time investigating Blue Badge fraud. We get good feedback from the public when we carry out these projects. We normally run about 2 projects a year. Last year we took part in the first London-wide Blue Badge Day of Action, which saw a large number of local authorities across London undertake a Blue Badge proactive project all on one day to try and tackle Blue Badge misuse across the borough. On that particular day, 53 badges were seized by the Special Investigations Unit. 53 were inspected and 9 were seized, 5 of which had expired and 4 were subject to investigation. In total, during 2023, we had 6 offenders receive simple cautions and fixed penalty notices when misuse was proven. And happy to answer any questions if everybody's got any questions at all. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. That's all from us, and we're happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. I think the first thing to do is to observe that on page 14, 82.1, the figures that you give there in Q3 continue to work proactively and reactively across the main fraud risk that are faced. This has led to CFT identifying loss prevention savings of 3.75 million in Q3, bringing the year-to-date total of 10.7 million against a target of 3.5. So if I'm reading that right, you've exceeded your target by 7 million, which really is a fabulous thing to have done, because, as a politician, I like a tagline, but it does seem to me, and I suspect to all my colleagues, that a fraud on the council is a fraud on every resident. Because if other people are causing money or value money's worth to be taken up, wasted, whatever, moved, it's money that we don't have to help residents. And it's a very simple, stark message that I think we probably ought to try and get across to our residents and also to the staff, because all too often the description of fraud is that there's no victim. And there's always a victim of some description. So perhaps that's a note worthy of observation and congratulations. One of the features that I was quite surprised about, in one sense, were issues regarding death of tenants. I didn't really understand what the loss was. Is it that we keep paying even though a person is deceased?
So in that instance, Chair, it's more about the loss of the organisation. So what we do is we look at data that will basically identify a deceased person in a council property that we're unaware of as an organisation. So the loss to the organisation is that we have an empty council stock property that is sitting vacant, and of course with homelessness at the moment and the cost of living crisis, that's very much needed.
Okay, I understand that. So it's the loss of the value in terms of, and that can be quantified obviously by the rent or whatever. Did wonder this though, if people have to have deaths have to be registered, I think.
So I can't answer that question as a whole, but yes, because obviously it's out of our remit, but in terms of what we look at, we do look at data about deaths that have been registered. Obviously there are tricky scenarios where people pass away abroad, but we are relying on people obviously registering deaths to highlight that in the data sets.
Yeah, I was just wondering if it would be, if it's possible or easier, that if a person passes away and then their death is registered and their address is entered in some way, bear in mind the registration's here anyway by a registrar probably in this building, whether or not there wasn't some easy way by which you could be told or housing could be told that this is a person with a local authority address.
Yeah, so there are death notifications that come via email to the services. But the other thing we do, because we have the London Counter Fraud Hub that has the up-to-date death register in it, and it's obviously looked after by the Cabinet Office, we have our tenancy data in there, and it just automatically matches, and we get new matches every 2 weeks, so it's very proactive. So it's ensuring that we're staying on top of it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On page 17, 8.7, on-site immigration official, can you please expand on this, how it works, and also how immigration relates to savings?
Yep, of course. So we've had an on-site immigration officer attached to the counter fraud team here for, I think we're coming up to 4 years now. So a lot of boroughs do have an on-site immigration officer within their structure, not necessarily in counter fraud. The whole premise behind it is it gives you access to the Home Office data sets, and it does two things. First of all, it gives you the ability to highlight someone's status to see if they're not entitled to council services, which obviously we're not giving away services or funding to people that aren't entitled to. Or second of all, it's actually helping in some cases, because the on-site immigration officer will actually speak to caseworkers and expedite people's cases, etc., and working alongside them.
All right, thank you, Councillor Banerjee.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Alex and team, for quite a comprehensive report. Staying on page 17 and looking at the sort of point 8.8 London Counter Fraud Hub, a couple of questions. It says we joined at the start of the financial year. Why did we not join this hub previously? Because it sounds like quite a great way to share sort of knowledge and information across London boroughs. And is it just focused on London, or are there opportunities to share across the UK? And the reason I ask this question is, say for example, let's call it an offender from Manchester moves into our borough and they're known for committing like housing fraud, it's good to sort of follow that pattern because he might try, or she might try the same fraud in our borough as well. So I'm quite a big fan of knowledge sharing across boroughs and just trying to nip these things in the bud. And as you said, prevention is better than cure. So any sort of light on that statement would be really grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Banerjee. The join date for Hillingdon was actually the first wave of the hub existing, which is why we joined then. It's a relatively new phenomenon in itself. The Cabinet Office have run the National Fraud Initiative for about 20 years, but that only happens every 2 years. They've now pivoted to more localised fraud hubs, and this is the London one which we've joined, which, as I mentioned earlier, is continuously running. So it's providing that data. In terms of the broader sets, this hub is just London boroughs, but other hubs exist currently. There's one that covers all of Hertfordshire, another which covers all of Essex. And going forwards, I think the Cabinet Office and their contractors are looking at how they can join those up more, but currently London, and then the overarching national systems that sit with the Cabinet Office are behind that for individual checks on specific cases.
All right, thank you. Councillor Batt.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for a very comprehensive report. My question is about the processes and procedures followed in relation to the decision-making behind outcomes or sanctions. So to use blue badge fraud as an example, I do find sort of fixed penalty notices between £100 to £200 in my personal view to be quite lenient. It's pretty much the cost of an expensive night out, really. So depending where you go, but not sure if there's any general guidelines for imposing this type of sanction. And I'm wondering what measure you use before these offences are taken a bit more seriously to perhaps the CPS or prosecution, and to what extent you are permitted to publish publicly those being sanctioned, because of course criminal cases are public. And I'm also wondering how you inform residents about these sanctions should they commit these types of fraud.
Thank you. I'll take that bit by bit, if that's okay, Councillor. So, okay, first of all, if we talk about prosecutions in general, so the decision on prosecuting lies with the Council Management Team, and there's 2 tests that we apply at the end of every case, and that is obviously the full evidential test and also the public interest test. When we're doing that, we're looking at mitigating circumstances, we look at the interview, depending if someone's shown remorse and honesty, is it a first-time offence? So there's a lot to consider on whether that actually for the public is the right thing to do is to prosecute. And obviously we have at disposal other ways of sanctioning. That is also fed through legal, so legal obviously have their input as well to see about our sound decision-making from that side. In terms of prosecutions, without giving too much away, obviously because things are live at the moment, there are 5 cases at the moment that we're looking into that cover blue badge, housing fraud, and 2 of them are about to go to legal. What we will do once the cases have come to fruition is the first thing we do is publicise them as a deterrent factor, so that will end up in Hillingdon People, it will end up on all our social media feeds, and it might even make it into any local press.
All right, thank you. Councillor Mathers.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of questions. On the Appendix C, the targets for KPIs for tenancy fraud and other investigations 4 and 5 are much lower than the others. I suppose I'm just asking why. I assume it's because they're harder, but I won't assume too much. And the other thing was, in terms of your risk assessment process and your prioritisation process, with such a I was going to say high savings target, but actually it's been exceeded, so maybe it may not be, but you can argue that way. Does the financial benefit sometimes skew, or does it have a higher weighting in that risk assessment process? And how do we make sure as a council that we are, as well as our own kind of counter fraud objectives, making sure that we're challenging the things that residents find most harmful or impactful? I'm particularly thinking around kind of beds and sheds or other consistent frauds that members of the public find particularly frustrating.
So, first of all, if I take your questions on 4 and 5 in Appendix C. So, they seem low, but if you actually look into the context of what we're trying to do, so take tenancy fraud referrals received, resulting in actually an outcome, a property. What we're saying there is, we're 30% of all referrals. Now, you have to go back to the referral itself. You've got to think that we get malicious referrals, we get referrals of poor quality. So actually to have a 30% sort of target rate is actually quite high. Your other point is very good as well about us and how much is weighted within the process. Yes, we are obviously totally aligned to the localised financial pressures of this organisation. However, the reputational risk and the needs of the residents is just as important, and actually the 4 sort of principles I outlined earlier are all evenly weighted.
Councillor.
Thank you, Chair. I'm not sure if this falls under your remit, but I wanted to kind of explore bribery and corruption, because, of course, since the Bribery Act 2010, in particular in my general reading, I found statistics online that across councils in the UK, there's been quite a large rise in the property development industry, particularly with planning officers. Without going into too much specifics, of course, what has your experience been in this area, and have you seen a rise in this kind of area?
So actually, I can actually honestly say in my career, and I have been here 16 years, and I'm now 9 years in counter fraud, I've actually never investigated or had to enforce the Bribery Act. I've never come across a case that's serious here in the borough. I'm not saying that we won't, but I have never come across it. So I can't fully answer that question. I'm really sorry, Councillor, but I can say that if there is anything to do with internal matters and there is an element of corruption or leading that way, they're taken very seriously. And normally HR will involve us as part of the internal investigations protocol.
Actually, that sounds like a good thing, really, doesn't it, that you haven't come across it before. Councillor Banerjee.
Thank you, Chair. Based on what the Chair said at the beginning of this meeting, I'm going to think very carefully about structuring this question. How can you explain to me, do you balance the sort of risk versus reward aspects of the team, in the sense that, and I don't want to just pick up on blue badges, for the sort of penalties enforced, the amount of work that went into getting those penalties may seem a lot to a lot of people, not to me. And I appreciate that if you don't enforce some of these measures, then they will be sort of ripe for people to, abuse some of these things. So how do you balance it, in terms of limited resources? And I think I am going in dangerous territory, so I'm going to stop.
No, it's perfectly fine question to ask. It's difficult, if I'm honest. There is, if we need to look at what we have in resources, obviously looking at financial risk, but also, like we mentioned earlier, what is seen as a high reputational risk. So it's a balancing act when putting the annual plan together and making sure that we're resourcing everything adequately. What I would say about blue badges, if they are very simple road traffic offences and that the person has been very honest, shall we say, within their interview, then actually they're not very time consuming, which helps. But it is very difficult balancing the act. I think we do it quite well to ensure that there's sort of like a full coverage from us across the fraud risks for the organisation.
Yes, Councillor Alderman.
Thank you, Chairman. As every London Borough is part of London Counter Fraud Hub, what have we learned from other authorities in terms of identifying fraud and preventing loss?
In terms of direct learning, I think the hub is more a method of communication and sort of sharing intelligence. So what it's doing is giving us the opportunity to collectively identify new and emerging fraud risks, particularly, and have a response to those. Some of the work that's coming through in the next year is a direct response to that kind of network and identifying that we're all seeing the same issues and giving us the opportunity to pool the data to address those directly.
you're obviously doing a very good job, and have got a very good team. And some time ago, the enforcement team who deal with things like food standards and product standards and even animal cruelty, that sort of thing, they became a lot more public and vocal, which I thought was a good idea, and equally making a big fuss about their successes. And it may be that you've got a natural reluctance as essentially fraud investigators to be too open in that sense. But I just wonder if it wouldn't be a good idea to publicise what you do a bit more. Because as Councillor Mathers said, the public do see things and have a kind of wish list, if you like. Now, when we deal with our policing colleagues on ward teams, we put together at the beginning of a year or a term or whatever some interesting topics as a consequence of speaking to residents. So we have a kind of league table of what they're interested in. And then we hand that over to the police and say, well, you know, apart from anything else, look at these. And I just wondered if a similar sort of exercise was possible to be organised in terms of fraud. Maybe some sort of article in Hillingdon People saying, look, you know, if you're worried about these things, then contact one of your team or something, and you could collect a list of observations or interests that, I mean, we could probably tell you. I mean, blue badges is definitely one, and people seeing other strange things happening in various properties and all the rest of it. But I just feel that, and it goes with also another question I had for you about training of staff internally, and their understanding and realisation, as I say, that it may look like a little bit of money here and there, but a lot of stuff adds up, doesn't it? And as I say, it is a blight on residents if there isn't money available, or at least if there isn't that money available, which is being used for something nefarious. So whether I mean, you may go away and think that's a daft idea, but whether it's an idea to be a bit more public about what you do, so that people know we're doing it, apart from anything else. Because again, a criticism which would be unjust would be, well, what are you doing about this? Well, loads, but we just don't talk about it very much. So maybe getting some ideas from the public about the sort of things they're concerned about, which will very often be things that you're already looking at. But it might help in terms of areas and types, because I think you said that you had 2 projects on blue badge things, and they're one of the most obvious things, aren't they? I think they've got complicated rules around them, and very often if people are challenged, they'll say, oh, well, the person who's blue badged this is at home or something, and I'm shopping for them. When they're at the Lido, walking around the beach, it's a bit difficult. Yeah, just a bit of an idea about a bit of push, a bit of success story. As I say, I know that the enforcement team, obviously, once they'd finished whatever there was they were doing, they would be very keen to get the success stories out there. So, but what about training of staff? Tell us about that.
So, if you don't mind, Chair, can I just go back to your first point about communications to the public? So, I think that's a really fair point from the committee. It's actually something we used to be really, really good at, and we need to pick that back up. So we used to, and we are looking to reintroduce, we used to do hashtag Fraud Awareness Fridays. So, and that is obviously alerting the public to different fraud risks each week and what they can do to report that. We also obviously are a big champion of International Fraud Awareness Week. And again, we do a lot of fraud awareness presentations within that to train staff within the Civic Centre about, obviously, the different types of frauds, things to look out for, indicators, how to refer. We also do publish, we've recently done a few, I think we've been in Hillingdon People a couple of times in the last 6 months around our property recovery to do with tenancy fraud. But I do agree with you. I think we can do more than what we have been doing. But internally, we have quite a robust fraud awareness program. So I think we've done 9 or 10 sessions this year already. We did 20 the year before. One of the sessions we did is Laura's actually seen the entirety of the homelessness section. So you're talking nearly 70, 80 staff. in bite-sized sessions, and it's really interactive. So it's not just about us sitting there talking to them. We actually finish on a bit of a game to try and get them to break the system. So then it allows us to understand what the risks are, and then we can have them conversations with senior managers, and it helps us identify what we need to do as well as what they need to do and how they need to be alert to it.
All right, thank you. Another specific was on 834, 8.0 on page 15, which I was interested in, which is in regard to B&Bs. And I didn't quite understand, again, is it a question of claims for people who don't exist, or claims for people who've moved on, or where's the loss, as it were?
So obviously right now we're in a cost of living crisis, and one of the things that will obviously play out for local authorities is an increase in homelessness. We obviously are seeing that at Hillingdon, so we're seeing more people approach and therefore getting booked into emergency accommodation while their claims are assessed. So that means the council are supporting them and are paying for accommodations, quite expensive accommodation, to landlords. What we're actually finding through our proactive residency work is that these people are not homeless at all, and they're not even staying in the bed and breakfast accommodation. So the bed and breakfast accommodation is then closed by us, which obviously is a saving because we're no longer providing that accommodation.
So is that part of a scam, or is it some sort of mistake, or what? You don't have to tell me if it is.
I think it's more the sign of the times. It's opportunistic fraud. I think it's people approaching in hard times, and they're probably thinking, well, I don't have to tell the council this, I don't need to tell the council that, I'll be fine. But what actually plays out, because if you think about the journey through housing, homelessness and approaching as homeless on the day is the start of the journey. Right at the other end, you could have your council property you may be entitled to. You've then got a discount on the right to buy. So there are a lot of fraud risks throughout the housing journey, and homelessness is the start of it. So it's more about opportunistic fraud. It's people maybe not telling the truth on their applications. And
are there, obviously discovering that is one thing and acting on it, but are there prevention techniques? You talk about a journey, and you're right, of course, but some of the fraud might be, as it were, accidental or as you say, opportunistic in a sense. So ranging from people not knowing what to do when they're in a certain position, and therefore costing the council money or costing the value of whatever it is money, up to a scam where someone goes along on behalf of somebody else and says, I need to be in a B&B, and the council pays out, and they're not there at all. So is there a capacity for significant prevention in terms of knowledge about what needs to be done?
Yes, I totally agree. So a B&B is something we've always dealt with proactively on project basis. Obviously, based on the figures that are in this report that you've seen today, it's something that we need to basically make business as usual for us due to the risk to the organisation. What I will say is about the other touch points within housing is going back into my report about Hillingdon's focus on prevention. And we have something called verifications, as I mentioned earlier. So actually, no one can actually get a council property in this borough without us verifying their circumstances against the allocation policy first. And the same applies to right to buy. Your right to buy will not complete until we've actually verified your right to buy to make sure you're staying in your council place, where the money's coming from, verified the funds.
And a broader question about cooperation. You said that some local authorities, maybe in London, as it were, don't do it like we do. If our way of doing things, as Hillingdon's mostly is the best way, what is the opportunity to be able to sort of spread that around? I'm thinking of London councils and the LGA, for example, and other pan-London organisations. You talked about the London Hub, which is a good thing, because one of the things going through the report I kept thinking was, well, surely there's a case for a pan-London, maybe, fraud directorate, whose job is to make sure that everybody's doing the same thing to a good standard, or to a high standard even. So I think the cooperation thing, as equally as Councillor Banerjee said earlier on, Obviously, we can't sort of deal with the whole country, but we can with our region and maybe our close neighbours. So, you know, the sort of home counties. Is there a kind of desire? You've talked about, Mark, the Cabinet Office sort of controlling things from above, but is there a desire to have ever better cooperation? Because fraud is not geographic, is it?
So it's really interesting. First of all, we'll talk about the way we do things here compared to other boroughs. We're not a traditional fraud team. We have the capabilities of being a traditional fraud team, but it's looked at very, very differently within the organisation, which is actually what's probably caused the success. So obviously, traditionally, if you think about fraud teams, the first thing you think about is prosecuting. You think about offenders, etc. That's very, very important, and it's a huge part of our role, but actually, so is the loss to the organisation. And actually, it's all about preventing funds within budgets. And that focus is seeing things like, as Mark has already mentioned, that we have the revenues inspections within counter fraud. I don't know any other counter fraud in London, another counter fraud team in London that has that. It always traditionally sits within the revenues departments. But there's a different spin at Hillingdon. It's looking at it from an investigative perspective and actually getting that detail to make sure that we're sending out the right billings across the borough. I think the other thing is I haven't seen other councils really do the verification processes we do. So you're right, there are opportunities. I've actually got the opportunity in May. I've been invited to the Institute of Internal Audit, to the South West Conference, to talk to everyone at the conference about how we do things here and how we've combated fraud in a post-pandemic world. So it is recognised. Something that we will be doing shortly is applying for some of the awards that are fast approaching in the public sector. There's the Public Finance Awards that are coming up, and there's things with SIPFA later on in the year. But to answer your second question about a sort of collective London view of tackling fraud, it does already exist. So we have the London Borough Fraud Investigations Group, and I'm very lucky to say that the three people to my right are all executive members, and Mark has also done a stint as chair. So there are discussions about across London how we do things, can we learn from each other. But some of the things we're doing here are quite, I would say, a bit radical, quite new. It's a bit out there, looking at it from a different spin, but it's working.
And just picking up on one of those points, and it's just a thought, would we be in a position to get other authorities to outsource to us some of the stuff that we're doing? It may be that we're staff-wise not, but because they're not doing it, and maybe missing out and not knowing how to do it, the idea of having, cross-borough projects or cross-borough ways of doing things, especially if we are doing things differently and slightly more radically and getting the sort of results that you're getting, rather than them reinvent our wheel, could we offer our wheel to them?
Again, really interesting question. Without giving too much away to the committee at the moment, because it's very early in our thoughts, it is something we're thinking about. It's very, very early on. There are obviously shared service boroughs that you see out within London, but we're also looking at there are other boroughs that actually act like a private operating model, and actually they sell the services to their neighbouring boroughs or whatever it be. So it's something that we're going to look into in the next financial year, but what direction we're taking right now, it's really too early to say.
Oh, we charge them all right, don't worry about that. All right. Any other questions from anybody? Councillor Banerjee.
Thank you, Chair. I had a thought, actually, on page 11, you mentioned innovation and modernisation, and that led me to think about how, as a council, we're moving to more of like a digital platform, and with sort of technology, you may sort of close one avenue for fraud, but it may open up several more. So I'd like to understand how you stay ahead of the curve, if you could explain it to me, with regard to like technological fraud, and is that sort of reflected in how you update the fraud risk register? So, for example, I think we're looking to put into practice a new ERP at the council. It may sort of open up, I'm just making this up, ways so that you can do additional fraud, and how do we sort of counteract that? Because, technology is great, but like I said, it can lead to additional fraud and more sophisticated fraud further down the line. Thank you.
It's a valid question. Obviously, as we move into a digital age that presents different fraud risks, something that we do in the Finance Directorate is the senior management team, when we look at transformation projects that are ongoing within the Directorate and that might involve new technology, internal audit and ourselves are having those discussions to highlight the risks and things that may come out from that. And then obviously that can inform part of the risk register if there's anything we need to do. In terms of that cybersecurity itself, that's more of probably a question for ICT and internal audit, because they deal with all sort of like cybersecurity reviews, etc. It's kind of a little bit outside of our remit.
All right. If there's no other questions, yes, there is.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You talk about homeless in B&B. If someone or a family, after making a homeless application, and then is put in the B&B, and obviously it costs a lot of money to the council. Have your team ever come across with such a situation where, due to an occurrence in system error, it took longer to get them settled in an adequate accommodation, where you couldn't find a fraud, but it was just a system error? That's why it took might be months and months.
So I haven't come across that exact set of scenarios, but of course, obviously with our remit, it's quite wide. It's not just fraud, it's fraud, loss and error, as you've mentioned, and it's mentioned through the report. So we do find sometimes that there are obviously errors within processes, not just housing, it could be anywhere, and obviously we then speak to the management team to get things rectified.
All right. Well, if there definitely isn't any further questions, thank you very much indeed. It's been absolutely fascinating. I think you find that you see that the interest from the questions is very high. And we wish you great success in the future and look forward to seeing you again when we need to look into this. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Committee.
So for us, in regard to this, agree the recommendations to the report? Agreed? Excellent, thank you very much. I think we ought to put some sort of comment about the success as well and the great work that they do. If you can fashion something along those lines, that would be very helpful, thank you. I'm sure Councillor Mathers and I will agree on that. All right, where are we now? Number 6. Update on the implementation of recommendations, performance monitoring and reporting review. You're on.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you, Committee. Colleagues will know that there was a review undertaken about 12 months ago into how the Council uses, processes, manages its data across the organisation. There was a series of recommendations that came forward that were endorsed by Cabinet. And what I'll do today is I'll kind of go through each of those recommendations and just provide an update on where we are. So recommendation 1A, there was a strong recommendation, a strong view that committee took that there should be active involvement from Cabinet members in the selection of the KPIs that are chosen and which eventually comprise the reporting that goes to CMT on a quarterly basis and eventually through to councillors. We've made good progress on that over the last sort of 12 months. One thing to note is that the report that goes to CMT is subject to constant evaluation. So we don't have a fixed set of metrics that don't change in the course of the year, because there is an appreciation that there will be priorities or pressures that emerge mid-year that CMT will need to be cited on. And a very good example of that is recently CMT have been asking for more information in housing, particularly around the instance of mould in our properties. And that follows the unfortunate instance of the young child in the Midlands who died following the housing association not doing the job that was asked of them. And so we've been asked to kind of bring forth data on kind of what is the number of calls we get associated with mould from our repair service, etc. So that kind of report that we bring to CMT is constantly being evaluated. What we've done more recently, however, is look to evaluate that or re-evaluate that in light of the council strategy. That was endorsed back in November by full council, and what we need to now do is ensure that the priorities that are set out in that strategy have the right mix or right suite of KPIs to kind of to enable councillors and the public and our residents to measure progress. How are we doing on delivering those priorities? And those are active conversations that we are having at the moment. I was at CMT this afternoon talking and presenting a draft list of KPIs, and I'll be meeting with directors over the next week to kind of finalise those and finalise the targets, and that will eventually go into a reporting framework which will go live from April. One of the asks of that is for cabinet members to liaise with their kind of portfolio holders to make sure that they are cited and those targets are kind of endorsed, verified, signed off, and make sure that we have that kind of that mandate, should we say, from each of the lead members that comprise cabinet. But in addition to that, and this was kind of strongly kind of reiterated during the course of the review, is that we do have more regular reporting in each of our areas. So in children's social care, in adult social care, in the place area, there is regular reports that cabinet holders, or the portfolio holders, do receive. And we've done some more work on that. So I'm working with Sandra Taylor, who's our Director of Adult Social Care, to kind of work on the one that Councillor Palmer will see, and equally working with Perry Scott, who's our Director of Place, to make sure that we have a right suite around complaints and member inquiries, because that's a lot of work we've done in that around the GOS platform and making sure that we've got the right kind of suite of indicators that goes through to councillors from that. Please interrupt me if you have any questions. I'll kind of go through each recommendation in turn.
In that case, if you want to do it that way, thanks very much. That's very helpful. I was just thinking about the KPIs. In terms of, this may not be the right expression, but sort of bench testing them to make sure that even the nature of them and the headings, as it were, and the type of KPIs in terms of the description. I suppose, is there a quality assurance, if you like, of the nature of them? You can have loads of KPIs and they mean nothing, or they might mean nothing. They have to tell you something, don't they? But more than that, you have to be collecting figures in relation to stuff that will tell you things. And is that something that clearly you do? But I mean, how do you ensure that you've got the right ones, as it were?
You're absolutely right. So you could measure anything, and what we do is benchmarking is an important part of that. Benchmarking is important in both setting of targets to make sure that we are in line with our peers. So we always look at our West London neighbours, for instance, to see how performance is there, to see how we match across that. But in terms of selecting those indicators, there are libraries of KPIs that we will draw on. And a good example is in housing. We've subscribed to Housemark, which is a national initiative where there is local authorities across the land, London and border, will submit data against a prescribed list of KPIs. And that then means something, because we can see how we are doing in line with our peers, but it also means that those KPIs have gone through some robust testing, and they've got common definitions, they are measuring the same sorts of things, and therefore we're comparing like for like. And we have that across kind of education, for instance, because there'll be statutory indicators which are given to us by Department for Education, Department for Health, and every local authority, will be reporting against those. So although we have local indicators, which are within our gift to define, a lot of our indicators are actually prescribed, and we would draw on those in terms of drawing up our list of KPIs.
I mean, sometimes when things go wrong, and we hear about it from other authorities or elsewhere, and sometimes, the answer is, we didn't know. Because we don't collect that data, and I just want, again, it's a similar theme. The extent to which we stress test the definitions of what we need to, or indeed if we hear about something else elsewhere that went wrong because whoever it is didn't look at the figures in relation to that thing, and it wasn't realised that was a risk when perhaps it ought to have been. Do we kind of double check and make sure we're doing that?
I think that just drawing on that example of the Wab's Law is a good example of that. So obviously that was an issue which emerged, which I've got to be honest, historically we may not have looked too much at that area, but obviously it's a risk, and now we are looking at it and evaluating that. And equally, another piece of work which my team often do is we will look at inspection outcomes from other areas, so Ofsted judgments, YJS judgments, send inspections, and look at things that are interesting, the likes of Ofsted, the likes of the Youth Justice Board, to make sure that we've got those measurements in there, we are tracking that. A really good example around the Youth Justice Board is around disproportionality, and that's a big issue in other parts of London, and it's a big issue for us now because we've brought it in, we're looking at it, there's a lot more scrutiny around it. So absolutely we are kind of proactive in terms of looking at things which may be a risk elsewhere and making sure that we've got the right data that we're looking at locally.
Naveed, sorry, your microphone. If that's
Apologies. Recommendation 1B, that from May 2022, select committees are also presented with high-level quarterly performance updates regarding services within their remit or terms of reference. So this work has been delayed, and it's largely been delayed because of the adoption of the council strategy and making sure that we do get that right suite of indicators. At the moment, the report that goes to CMT is about 110 different KPIs, and kind of making, kind of organising that in a way that's relevant to select committees is not the kind of easiest of tasks, but also we want to make sure that the measures that do come to the select committees are the right ones, and the ones that are relevant to the work of those particular select committees. And so that is something which will follow the conclusion of the work that we're doing with CMT at the moment in selecting those KPIs that will comprise the balanced scorecard.
I was just thinking about that because we've got in this committee 12 relevant service areas, and they're probably the biggest ones in the council. And if we had KPIs for each one of those, we'd be here till probably Christmas looking at them. So I suppose the idea would be that we would select to sort of dip into various topic heads, because we couldn't have all of them. I mean, if all of them were available, fine, committee members could have a look at them. But in terms of publicly being seen to look at them, I think we'd have to be selective, otherwise it would be just an overload of information. So that may be a criteria to look at in terms of work programme selection. Maybe, I don't know, one topic per meeting or something. Or
Thank you, Chairman. I mean, we have our select committees are now very well aligned with cabinet portfolios and directorates. So is there more scope now to better know what you would potentially report to select committees?
There is absolutely a number of ways we can do this, and because of that greater alignment between directorates and the select committees, we have reports that go to each of, so Children's Social Care, for instance, Children's Services have a report that goes to Councillor O'Brien. It covers information on education, on school places planning, on our work with schools around performance, Children's Social Care, SEND, Youth Justice. So it's broad coverage of kind of areas. There is no reason why we wouldn't be able to bring a subset of that report to committee, and we'll give you a kind of flavour of what's going on. Absolutely.
All right, thank you. I interrupted you. I think you were getting to 1C.
Thank you. So this kind of picks up on my earlier point around engaging cabinet members in the metrics. So that's going to be one of the asks of CMT in the work they're doing right now, is to ensure that once we've selected those KPIs, that they get appropriate cabinet sign-off, and then we will kind of continue reporting those per the quarterly cycle. Recommendation 2 was around performance culture, and this was really heavily focused around data quality and the importance of data quality for an organisation like Hillingdon. Data quality is kind of front and centre in a lot of the work that we do as a team. We spend a lot of our time working with directorates to improve data quality, make sure that they are proactive in entering information the right way first time. We are just entering now a cycle of our statutory returns, which will be going back to Whitehall in June. And as part of that, we will hold workshops, we will hold training sessions, making sure that people are entering the data in the right way into case management systems. There will be briefings that will be held, we will attend SMTs, and to be fair, that's a regular annual cycle of work that we do. In addition, this year we've carried updates in the head teachers' briefings, because one area where we often struggle is schools not updating data in the right way. And we have 3 big census returns that we do every year, and it's an effort to go back to the admin teams within the schools to say, you're missing data on this pupil in this box, and that's something that we've tried to proactively deal with this year by engaging head teachers in the head teachers briefings to kind of emphasise the importance of getting that right. So that's a regular piece of work that we've done.
I think being able to show, I mean, the trouble with data and input and all the rest of it is that sometimes it's not considered to be part and parcel of, for example, in teaching, that their job is to teach, not to give data to local authorities, especially when the umbilical cord is so stretched between us. Having the capacity to show how it can influence or how it can show good things or bad things, how it can direct them in a certain way, is always the trick, I think, because otherwise they just think they're filling out forms for no good reason. Literally being able to have a demonstration, say, well, look, because you gave us this, we discovered that, and therefore we were able to benefit you, or whatever.
A really good example is work around free school meals, because they are supposed to share, or schools share that data with us, and we've done an awful lot of work around the household support grant, and making sure that families that are eligible, or children that are eligible for free school meals, get the vouchers that they need. And the data we were getting back from schools was of poor quality, and we worked hard to kind of show them, if we don't get that data right, or if you don't get that data right first time, it's your pupils, your parents, your families that will be kind of suffering or disadvantaged in the back of that. So that's a good example of how we've been kind of proactive, showing them the importance of good data.
All right, thank you. And then recommendation 3?
So performance information. So performance innovation. There was a recommendation from a committee around the tools that we use and improving those. I think we, as an organisation, are falling behind the curve in many respects in terms of the tools that we deploy. Power BI, Tableau are standardised tools now, which many organisations, both in the private sector and the public sector, use, and we've not quite got there yet. So there was a recommendation to explore those options. And in fact, there was a paper that I took to CMT on February the 8th, where a proposal was put together to bring in Power BI. CMT asked for a more strategic option, and there was a meeting held this morning with me, Louise Bateman, who's the head of ICT, and an organisation called Better Gov, looking at those options. So we are bringing that forward.
All right, thank you very much. Well, look, those are very full reviews of recommendations, and this is really important because the way in which we do this and the effectiveness, and again demonstrating the use of it is all important, and that's clearly coming out. So yeah, thank you very much. Unless there's any other questions from anybody. Nope. All right, thank you so much. That's really helpful. Thank you very much. Thank you. All right. Was there anything for us to agree there, or I don't think? Oh, hang on. Recommend that. Yeah, just to note, just to agree the recommendation on page 27 that the committee notes the progress made and the work that is outstanding to be done. But we got a pretty good report and update there from our officer. Excellent, good. All right. So, Cabinet Forward Plan, Mark?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. You've got the list in front of you of the items under this committee's remit, which are coming forward for Cabinet or Cabinet member decision over the coming months. And I've tabled an additional item which has cropped up since we published the agenda, which is HR item. It's the Matrix contract, which will be coming to Cabinet for an extension, and that provides agency support around frontline services, technical, professional admin staff.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. So you've got the work programme in front of you. We've scheduled the members' inquiries update, how that's going. It's only been a few months if you think about it, but that's scheduled for an update in April, so you can see how that's working. And in June, you've got an item I think Councillor made this, but suggested, and the committee agreed on the contact centre and transition to digital, and how that's impacting or residents and how they're engaging with that move. And then a service area you've not covered for a while because we've not had a permanent head of HR in place, but we do have now, and we thought July would be a good time for her to bed in, look at the service, and come to you with an update on how they're modernising their processes. So that's scheduled for July.
Okay. We did say much earlier on when this committee was put together that we would welcome the opportunity to have a look at HR, but of course it was in a bit of a flux when we were talking about it, so that would be a good one. I think at the next meeting we've got the last somewhat forward-thinking session on procurement, because I did want them to have the opportunity to tell us what they'd really like to do and what would really be very innovative as a sequence of ideas to put forward. I think we've done a heck of a lot of good work on that. We've had very, very good presentations. But I would just like to get a feel for what would be, almost what they would really wish for if they could do it. And to include that sort of thing in a report is useful because it shows direction of travel and also that type of thinking. Another area that we were thinking about was in terms of looking at the transformation programme, but in terms of how our staff, and it's worth sometimes looking at our terms of reference, because there are 12 enormous areas that we get to review and look at. And one area that I thought might be useful is that in terms of the transformation programme and the digitalisation and all the new stuff that's been happening, how we are and how staff are being supported and being walked through this new system, so that they're able to adapt to it to the best of their abilities. So maybe something along those lines at some point to have a look at how staff have reacted to it, how they see it in terms of is it better, is it more difficult, how does it do? Because it's clearly there, it's clearly working well, given the extent of the change. There may be areas where it isn't so much, but I'm quite interested to see where how the staff have responded and how they've taken to it.
All I would add to that, Chairman, there is an annual staff survey that staff complete. Well, I think one was done last year, so there's a staff survey, and you can pick up things about that from there. It might also be useful linked to that because the council does have a learning and development programme where there are a number of courses, both specialised, mandatory, such as data protection that staff have to do, and skills to invest in our staff so they can, become future leaders even. I think there's a management learning programme that we undertake as well. So maybe a broad view of what we invest in our staff in terms of training could be something the committee might want to start off with, and then you could move on from there about specific areas where staff how they've transitioned in terms of their skills from an old process to a new process, i.e. transformation.
Well, is there a nice pithy sort of label for that, or a name for that sort of area we need to look at?
We can call it learning development skills of staff, something like that. Yeah, I can put something in for you.
All right. What do you think, Stuart? No, Councillor Moses.
No offence at all. I like the idea around the talent and development. My thinking was, so we've just had an item around effectively finance, just how we can draw more financial aspects in. So there are two, excuse my excitement around some of these things, but with a challenge in your head, we know that treasury is something that comes out in the budget quite heavily, and how the council has to manage and keep on track of a huge portfolio of different streams of bits and pieces. So I suspect in terms of our ability to support that, I think it's always useful to understand some of the challenges they face. We know that, for example, at times there are auditors who aren't available, and that's slightly different, but there are different cohorts of recruitment that are difficult, and those sort of aspects, and just generally understanding the mammoth task that our finance teams undertake. The other area that I thought might be quite useful is, I know it's sometimes mentioned in the monthly monitoring in the Cabinet papers, but looking a little bit at how the bid team are working, the savings programmes, just a more regular on track that we are, a bit of explanation around that as the appropriate committee.
Yeah, yes, I think that's a good idea. We can build that in. I was very taken with that business about KPIs coming to us in terms of our portfolio responsibilities. You know, I mean, I've said it 3 times now, but I mean, there's 12 areas, and they pretty much cover almost everything. And what they don't, and the bits that they do cover are massive. I think what we're going to have to do, and I think it's a good idea for us to see them and look at them and see what the trends are and see what we can divine from it. But I think what we should do is to be quite discriminatory about what we do look at. I mean, we can't look at everything. I mean, I should imagine it fill that whole gap in the middle there if it was in paper. But for us to all start thinking about those areas that we're interested in. And one of the things I did in a former committee many years ago was to divvy up the looking at various issues so that different councils would say, well, I'll look at that and I'll report back, rather than everybody looking at everything, because you're not going to do it. I mean, none of us are going to do all the stuff, are we? So it's just a thought process that if you look at the heads of responsibility that we've got in those 12 areas, if anyone's got a particular one that they'd quite like to have a look at themselves, and then do just a brief talk to the committee about that and what they can see from it. Obviously, we'll get somebody from the officer corps to come and tell us all about it, but that I think that might be quite interesting and quite helpful. And we'll obviously, because he's not here, give Councillor Lewis the very biggest of those. So, you know, if you're not here, you get the big stuff. All right, thank you. If there's nothing further, I think we've gone through the whole agenda. Unless anyone's got anything else that they want to add, I'll close the meeting.